I'm going to be talking primarily about the agates that we find in Canterbury, although the talk was entitled Agates of New Zealand. I'm going to restrict it to pretty much Canterbury because that's where most of it is all happening anyway. And so we'll see how we go. This is a sketch, an artist's drawing. What that artist thinks would be a fairly accurate description of the sequence of volcanics in the Mount Somers area. And we'll go on to something a little bit more professional at the moment, but it gives you an idea of what has come up from underneath and what it has travelled through. And mostly the eruptions have come through what we call the Rakaia Torles, or the greywacke deposits that were already laid down. Now this happened when about 90 million years ago, when we were still part of Gondwana. In other words, we were sort of tacked onto the edge of Queensland and also very close to Antarctica in the mix. And as with all tectonic plates, there's an area of heat generated by the meeting of these plates, whether they hit each other and go up in the air or whether they subduct and go underneath one another, is always the greatest source of volcanic action. And so back then, this was probably the setting in which the eruptions took place. This is a more modern understanding of the Mount Somers eruptions, and there are at least 5 and probably 7. There's a new publication, and it's over here on the table if you want to have a look at it. I think it's downloadable. It's the printed copy there, and I think there are now recognised as about 7 distinct volcanic eruptions or events in the Mount Somers area. So the yellow was one of the first eruptions, and that is the Surrey Hills tuff. I'm going to use the word tuff. Some people like the word tuff. And that was probably one of the earliest eruptions. Then the pink represents Barossa andesite. The black is Woolshed Creek ignimbrite. And the paper by Cole over here talks quite a bit about the Woolshed Creek ignimbrite. It wasn't in the publications years ago, so whenever we found this black rhyolithic looking rock, we just called it rhyolite. However, the rhyolite and the ignimbrite are composed of exactly the same products, but they were just injected in a slightly different way. The blue is Somers rhyolite, and then the aqua is Somers ignimbrite. Now, the very important one there to remember is the Somers rhyolite, because that and some of the ash and ignimbrite feature largely in the contribution to the agate story. With our andesites and rhyolites and dacites, it is difficult to tell which you've got, because the stage from one to the other is really only the amount of silica that volcanic rock contains. And that's pretty difficult to ascertain by an in-hand inspection. So to really be accurate, you need an appraisal. But there are some characteristics about some of these which generally can help you understand what you've got. And you're going to be very hard pressed to find any agates in Canterbury rhyolites as such. The consistency of the lava did not lend itself to gas bubbles forming, and so we need that as a background to infill to affect an agate buildup. There is an example here of, I haven't mentioned basalt up here because there was no basalt mentioned in the scientific paper. However, there are a couple of small outcrops of basalt in the area, and I think the most common one was what we call the Brothers, but it's a much more recent volcanic, and it's nowhere near the age of these. And as far as I'm aware, there's no agates in those basalts. There are some very small agates in the Waimakariri Gorge basalts. Basalt tends to be darker and much more compact. However, a very, very popular basalt or agate producing basalt are the ones at Agate Creek, Australia. And there's an example here just to show you the numerous little agates that form in that. And over here, there is an example of the Mount Somers ignimbrite with a small thunder egg. And of course, in the last 2 or 3 years, the thunder eggs from the ignimbrites have become very well known. A small group of people have been finding them, but they're well known in the big scene. Most of you will probably know pretty much where the main agate areas are in Canterbury. And just for your information, we'll quickly run through. There's a huge agate field in the Rangitata, or above the Rangitata Gorge, in Stew Point, Rata Peaks, a wee bit on Coal Hill, and a little bit on what I mentioned, Stew Point, Rata Peaks, and Coal Hill mainly. Then we've got the Gawler Downs complex here. We've got a big area around the back of Mount Somers itself, which is all rhyolite here, but the andesite crops out here, around the back, and across here, across the river. Then it's not marked here, but there are some agates on Mount Alfred in 2 or 3 places. Then we pop over to the Melbourne Hills, just over Akaya Gorge, and across here. Now, it also doesn't show up in here. There's a very small pocket of andesite at McQueen's Valley, and believe it or not, it's all part of the same huge field which runs right underneath the Canterbury Plains and pops up here, and it's surrounded by Banks Peninsula, which is comprised of much, much younger volcanics, maybe 12 to 15 million years old. So if you know the right people, you can find some agates here in McQueen's Valley. And of course, there are agates in 1 or 2 other spots around here, quite small, but very distinct. Many years ago, people thought that agates were formed simultaneously with the volcanic eruptions. And I remember as a young person hearing the older rockhounds talking about the fact that these must have been hot and all stewed up and grew at the same time as the volcanics poured out, but that is not true. And these are some of the basic things that we've learned over the last few years about agate formation. Agates are always secondary fillings of rock cavities. Agates in basalts and andesites are not the products of volcanic activities. They are later fillings of cavities in the cooled lavas. I'm not sure if it's cold, but one of the reports has come out recently that maintains that the Mount Somers Woolshed Creek agates are about 17 million years younger than the andesites. There's a long, long time later, and gives credence to the thought that they are not simultaneous with the outflow of the lavas. Agates develop only in the pressure temperature field of sedimentation and diagenesis. Diagenesis is the breaking down of other rocks, including the lavas and including the minerals which seep down through the ash and so on. And they think the highest temperature now is about 180 to 200 degrees, and probably between 50 and 60 mostly. So there's been a big change in the perception of temperatures in which agates form. The minerals that build agates, mostly silicates, are transported to the place of agate building, that is the rock cavity, by aqueous solutions. And you might think, well, how did that happen? So if we go back to this diagram, once 1 or 2 eruptions had taken place, quite often a lake would form on the top of the andesite outflows, and that lake may have been there for centuries or millennia before the subsequent eruptions took place. And so there was ample opportunity for meters, hundreds of meters of ash and ignimbrite and volcanic detritus to be erupted over the top of these lakes, which were over the top of the andesites. So there was plenty of opportunity for the glass and the obsidian and the high silica minerals found in the ash and the ignimbrites to be dissolved and to permeate the lower reaches of the andesite rocks, which contain all the gas bubbles. So one of the things we have to realise when we're looking for agates, there has got to be a source of silica and other minerals in solution, and we need to look at where that came from. But it could be that we can't find those sources because of what's happened to the overburden of other volcanic actions. And so the reason why we don't find agates in the North Island, where all the volcanic plateau is full of andesite, but there are no agates because there's been no overlying volcanics to supply it. Just to find out, there are a few open pathways to be found in the host rock that would be broad enough for solutions to get in and out. In the agate matrix, there are very often only fine capillaries that fill in contact with watery solutions and trap these solutions by capillary forces. And so we've just got a brief diagram here showing where some of the jasper and agate nodules can form. And we can also see that it doesn't always happen in the same strata level. Stratas can be upturned and shifted. And in the lava flow here, we've got some gas bubbles represented here. And those shapes, of course, can be altered by all sorts of things happening in that moving lava. And so we find a lot of agates are what we call lenticular or almond shaped because of the way that the gases rise within the lava flows. And when, of course, that orientation shifts, we get an entirely different orientation within the agate. So we don't always find teardrops with the banding that way, but you find a teardrop on its side with the same parallel banding. So the orientation has shifted before the agate was formed. These are just some of the weird shapes that we can find agate in, and these are just a few from around mid-Canterbury, and you can see how weird and wonderful some of these cavities can be shaped by the movement of the lava. There are one or two other precursors which affect the way in which agates form and how they form, and that is pH can be a factor, and pH is simply the degree of acidity or alkalinity in the solutions, and that's really pH just means the potential of hydrogen. The pressure that these rocks are under, whether they are under tons and tons of pressure or whether they're near the surface, the temperature and the time involved. We have a perception that it takes a long, long time for agates to form. Now that may be true in terms of the geological time framework in which they've been discovered or when they were laid down, but the actual act at the moment of formation may be as low as a few hours to a few weeks. So we're not thinking 5 million years for these agate cavities to fill. We can be thinking much less than that. Just an example of how the little agates can form inside the andesite, and you'll notice on the left-hand side there's been a break at some stage in history, and it's cemented itself over with chalcedony or sometimes calcite, and these can make very interesting specimens in agates where you get a shift or a healed fracture and so on. What is an agate? There's some quite simplistic definitions which are true. It's a nodule of band in chalcedony. Yes, that's true, but it's not comprehensive enough for the agate collector who finds agates that doesn't have just banded chalcedonic. It has all sorts of other features going on in it. And so the definition that I like comes from the Glossary of Geology, which says agate is a translucent cryptocrystalline variety of quartz, being a variegated chalcedony, frequently mixed or alternating with opal and characterized by colours arranged in alternating stripes or bands, in irregular clouds or in moss-like forms. Agate is found in virtually all colours, usually of low intensity. It commonly occupies vugs in volcanic rocks and cavities in some other rocks. So that's a good comprehensive definition of agate. And I quite like that one instead of just the usual ones. And just a little note on the source of some of these materials that I've mentioned in terms of what eruption they come from, but silica sources for agate was most likely the devitrification. It's a big long word, it just means the breaking down of volcanic glass, of ashes yielding silica gels that percolated downwards, collecting in vesicles near the bases of ash flows or in underlying volcanic rocks. Spherulitic crystallization is initiated when these silica gels come into contact with minerals such as carbonates and sulfides from high pH alkaline lakes that formed on the rhyolitic or andesitic terrain. One of the authors that I have read a little bit about believes, and it's not only his belief, it's substantiated by others, that we need carbonates, in other words, the calcite family minerals, to initiate the production of chalcedony. And in nearly all the examples this man studied, calcium, or calcite rather, or the carbonates were present in that equation, and he believes it's a necessary ingredient. Marco believes that all agates are comprised of about 4, if not 5, what they call facies. And facies are just various stages of a geological formation. You may or may not have noticed, you've probably noticed this if you're an avid agate collector, that many agates start off with a layer around the edge, which is slightly different than the rest of the agate. It's generally doesn't have bands in it. It can be a little bit granular. And this is what Marco calls stage 1. And he believes that actually all agates have this very first stage, in which he calls the first chalcedony layer. And he believes that first layer formed initially, and then there may have been quite a gap between the features that followed. So next time you look at some agates, have a close look, because I had never really noticed this until I read his book. And sure enough, a lot of agates have got this clear little band right around the edge. Now, you won't see it in some environments. Of course, you won't see it on the beach agates because it's all being ground off, probably. He also believes that every other formation that we find in agates, apart from the concentric banding, the parallel banding, the opal, and the quartz, every other feature that we find in an agate, including moss, plumes, etc., are all part of the very first layer that ever came into that cavity. And I've given a really good example here to demonstrate what he's saying, and you can have a look at this too. And this demonstrates perfectly what he's talking about. The first layer of liquid and sediment has come in and started to form like stalactites, etc., within the cavity, and then the solutions run out. And on the bottom here, we've got common opal, which is also a very, very common feature of agate formation. The next stage is what he calls stage 2A, which are little hemispheres. It's a banded formation, but he calls that stage, it calls that 2A. Then we have 2, I'm not sure which is 2B. Then we have parallel banding, which is a common feature of agates. Then we have a concentric banding around here. Then we can have a cavity with white. Quite often agates have got a white banding in here, and it's most probably opal, as in common opal. And then the last to form in an agate is what we call euhedral quartz, or massive quartz, or if there's a cavity, the quartz crystals will be terminated. So generally speaking, they represent the facies of most agates. And here's a good example of one here. It doesn't have the cavity, of course, but it does demonstrate the chalcedony layer, and it does demonstrate what we call concentric banding. This is one that demonstrates more so here, if Marco is correct. This area here is part of the initial inflow, which probably came in at the top of the agate and fell or settled on the bottom. Then we have the water level banding and the concentric banding and so on. Slightly different again, but if you look closely, here's the first chalcedony layer right around the edge, and then we have some strange features in here, and then we have the internal parallel banding again with the euhedral quartz surrounding the sector. Another one demonstrating all of those, but with an added feature. The cavity, which was quartz lined, received a further infill later on in its life, and then we have another little agate forming right in the centre, and we call those floaters. Again, here's the first chalcedony layer right around the edge, but all this stuff here was also part of that first influx, and this is a combination of opal and clays which were formed from the byproducts of some of the lava rocks. And again, these are some examples showing you the different facies of how that can be demonstrated in practice. These are part of the first chalcedony layer, big columns which came down from the top and then later on filling with and here's a really good example of the first influx, virtually taking up the whole agate, and then finally a little bit of white opal right through here, and a wee bit of just about euhedral quartz, but quartz in the centre here. And what's fascinating about a lot of the Rangitata agates or stew point agates, the moss kind of isolated little capsules, and then the chalcedony and the banding came in later and formed another little agate formation right in the middle. And they're quite interesting, those little fellows there. Again, this doesn't have any banded chalcedony. So according to Marco, this represents the initial infill, and it filled the whole cavity and nothing else took place. And it's quite feasible when you think about that falling to the base of the agate, and then all the rest of the mineral mosses forming in a granular chalcedony. And again, a nice mixture of moss, first phase, and then actually pretty much all the phases, and right at the very centre a little bit of amethyst. And another one representing the moss growth and the carnelian. I'm not sure if I've got one in here, just I think John will recognise that one. Another lovely plume, and the centre, and more plumes representing that first layer again. And of course, we all know the white agates with the different formations. Another interesting factor which Marco talks about are the three families of minerals which make up or are included within agates, and he talks about opal and jasper and chalcedony, and he believes that each of those comprise of two different varieties of each. There are two varieties of opal, two varieties of jasper, and two varieties of chalcedony. And he said, if we can look at these under the microscope, we find that they're all made of what he calls polymers, which are incredibly small circular balls, very, very small. And each of those opal and jasper and chalcedony, the structure of those polymers is different. So we often have little bits of arguments about whether this is an agate or is it a jasper, or is it a jasper agate, and so on. And we can't really tell unless we could look at them under a powerful microscope and see the structures of the jasper or the chalcedony or the opal, and we would not know until we saw that. Again, just another strange little agate with plumes and a bit of opal down here. Another agate which demonstrates that very first chalcedony layer in the form of stalactites, and some of these have even collapsed before they hardened, and they're actually lying on the base here rather than extending right down like a full stalactite. Again, another one, just showing you that formation, their initial formation that was never completed. One of my favourites, and Tyler's too, are the agates which contain other minerals, or mineralized agates. Now, some of these minerals are related to the iron family, and in this process of the laying down of chalcedony, the minerals present in this solution were not compatible with the production of banding, and so they were kind of pushed out to one side. So we have this area here has been pushed out of the laying down of the chalcedony, or the granular chalcedony, or it grew in this cavity prior to the deposition of the chalcedony. And I wouldn't like to say which was which in that example, because there's some of those growths don't rest on the skin of the agate, so they took part during the production of the agate, whereas some of them were already there prior to the influx. And there's another really good one from View Hill showing you the mineralization process, and also from probably Kakanui or one of the beaches of North Otago with the little mineral balls in them. And that's one of my little favourites from Stew Point. It's quite small, but just the two halves. And that's another great one showing you the mineral growth in the.
It's a very one.
It is. And up close and personal, the iron mineral, one of the iron oxides, hematite probably, and I can't explain how chemically that reaction takes place. I'm afraid you might find something in one of those publications. I'm just not quite aware. We'll race through these. There's some more of the strange little mineral flowers that form in a Paula Downs agate. And these are independent of any skin of the agate. So they grew simultaneously with the laying down of the chalcedony. Some tubes. I'm just running through a few now. I won't take a whole lot more time. Some of the different formations we see in agates, and tubes are a very common one. And this one has some tubes of common opal, and a good old Whitecliffs one with lots of tubey growths all going everywhere, and a close-up of a cave stream agate, and another one from the Hines River, I think it is, with these lovely tubes all surrounded by this green vegetation and so on. And these tubes are growing in a little agate infill in petrified wood from Mount Summit. And a really super one from the Ashburton River, and virtually a whole quartz agate, just and it had one redeeming feature, and it was a near perfect bullseye. And we've got all, that's why we go to White Cliffs. And those represent, you remember on this diagram over here, the little hemispheres. So up on the outside with that first chalcedony layer, and then we've got the little hemispheres. And this has been domed, and it represents the skin of the agate, and these little hemispheres are protruding inwards. And another floral one that Jamie will recognise. Jamie found this one on the Hines River, and lovely little chrysanthemums. And then scenic agates are another phenomenon again. This is a nice scenic agate from White Cliffs. And a good old Hetties scene. Another Hines River. And one of my favourites from White Cliffs. A little story about that one. I posted that online maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And a guy started up a new Facebook group in the States called Jaspers Only. And the rules were, it must be American, it must be Jasper, and it must be found by you or something. And you know what? The header page was my agate.
Wasn't even Jasper.
Yeah, not even a Jasper, not even from America. And so I laughed about this, and I put a note in the agate collectors worldwide and said, guess what's just happened? And I didn't name them or anything like that. And within about an hour, it was gone. So word gets around, but he had photoshopped it.
That's a stunner.
To such an extent that everything just about was that red, and it was so inaccurate. It wasn't funny. Again, just granular chalcedony. I didn't realise that there was such a thing as granular chalcedony and fibrous chalcedony. And a lot of agates are made up of both. And in fact, if we examine each band in an agate, it's made up of 3 different components. One is granular chalcedony, one is fibrous chalcedony, and one is quartz. And in nearly every agate, each band is comprised of those 3 components in combination. Some are not quite the same, but you need a microscope to see that. And so then I began to learn about granular chalcedony and why it's granular and why it's fibrous. Depends on the factors within the gel that cause that to be initiated. I put this on a group years ago, and one of the whips on the group put some rather apt little expressions on there. It's a good old magpie agate.
That was you, though, wasn't it?
Sorry,
That was you.
that put the boat on.
No, it's in the boat.
Oh, it's been in the boat. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the other one's Mark. Nice, an unusual heady slip, and a good demonstration here of this probably opal, or at least one form of opal, and it takes up this lovely snowy scenic effect, which you'll all be familiar with in some agates. That's I'd love to have seen the complete agate because there's quite a bit missing there, I think.
How big was the actual sample?
This is quite a good one. It's about 100 or 120 long. Yeah, and this is quite small, but I call this Tornado Alley, and it's a small magpie agate. But there's another formation again. I'm not sure that I could explain exactly how that took place. Probably a form of stalactite of some sort. And just a typical Canterbury geode, or maybe not typical, but a good one, but a Canterbury geode. So geodes are another geode, agates, or agate geodes are another form of agate we can collect. Another one from Hetties showing the calcite crystals on the inside. And also a nice little favourite of mine from Weir. Dew Point, yes. Showing it's a good one which shows just about all the features of these facies that we're talking about. You can see a little bit of the chalcedony layer, first chalcedony layer, and all this. Then we've got the banded piece here, concentric banded and quartz, and the euhedral quartz on the centre. There's even got the hemiagates up here, see? Another stew, a good little stew point showing again the first chalcedony layer. I'm persisting with this a wee bit because I don't think many of us have ever noticed it before. So I want to verify that it's true. And good old Heinz carnelian. And a real interesting hodgepodge down the bottom of various opals, and with a very plain cap, but the bottom of course redeems it. And Rangitartle River, but Stew Point is showing the opal base. And a strange little fellow from the Heinz River. Probably getting into a jasper now. And certainly a jasper again. These are part of the other talk, sorry, but I'll run through a few quickies. There's jasper from the Heinz is quite large. It's about so big. Another Heinz jasper with moss agate at the base. And a Scenic jasper. A nice little magpie jasper. Jasper agate. Yeah, the magpies are notorious for that combination of the two. Another little Rangiards here. And of course, related to all this are the agatized woods, and that's a nice one from Mount Somers, where we have a replacement process, similar to what we've been talking about, but where the forests have been covered with ash, but the same silica has leached down through and replaced the wood. And that's an agate, a rotted out piece of wood which is filled with agate with beautiful tubes and red and so on. And of course some ignimbrite with a little thunder egg formation in it. And I talked earlier about these shifts in agate. That's quite a unique one. It's shifted 3 or 4 times and healed up every time. Oh, if you want to, you can make some beads out of agate. And that's a little section of one from down Meraki Way with their little needles and the dendrites. And of course, you know where that is. And another nice white cliffs. And a nice Melbourne Hills. And a nice amethyst from Rockhound Gorge that Robin found. A nice, just a formation in a Mount Alfred agate. And anyone know where that one's from?
Easy sleep.
Not quite.
Allen's Slip.
This is from Allen's Slip. Sorry, John, what did you say?
Allen's Slip.
Yeah, Allen's Slip. Typical colour of Allen's Slip. And just as a unique one, you can try this if you wish. Some of the Rangiartia agates, they're just straight, only about that deep, but they're all parallel banding. They don't look very much at all. But if you cut them through, if you cut them with the bands,
Get some strange effects.
you can get some very, very interesting formations. And a nice Heinz one again that shows you all of those facies pretty much. and another different one again. I'll just mention this here. There's also, I did a book review a few weeks ago about a book in which this man believes that microorganisms also play a very, very important role in the rock building process. And part of his book is dedicated to what he thinks were microbial action in the formation of agates. And so now that we've discovered that agates form at much lower temperatures than we first thought, and were not initiated at the time of the eruption, it's very feasible that microorganisms can survive in temperatures well within the range that agates are now formed. Microbes may well have played a role in the formation of agates. And this is a great example of how this could be quite possible when you read Marco's book on the subject. And what he describes here in this little agate is that this here is typical of the microbial action that he finds within many other kinds of rock. So it's a kind of a collaboration between the living world and the chemical or mineral world. And he believes implicitly that this is an incredibly important part of our learning process in terms of so many different types of rocks. And I put this in here because that, to me, it demonstrates his point very well. And when that collaboration finished, we find the banded opal in the centre. It's filled in with the banded opal. So I just popped that in there for. So I'll just leave it there. And if you want to come and have a look at these later, or if you've got any questions, I will attempt to answer them.
Thank you.